Science-based lifting is big right now. Every little detail of how to optimize your gains has been mapped out, but do you find it's all a bit too much? Most of us aren't hardcore dedicated lifters. We just want to get in shape, look a little better, and fit training in whenever we can. So how can the average Joe pick out the best of the science-based training to transform our bodies without spending insane hours in the gym? I'm Dr. Karan, an NHS surgeon, and in this podcast, we cut through the BS of modern health advice and tackle the biggest issues in science and medicine. Helping us to choose the stuff that's really going to help us the most is Dr. Brad Schoenfeld, the go-to guy when it comes to advice on building muscle. Brad has authored over 200 scientific papers, and his work is cited by pretty much every fitness influencer out there, and for good reason. In this episode, we find out whether you can get gains from just one day a week of training, whether the gym bros were right about training to failure, the science of lengthened partials and supersets, how many reps you need to be doing, and a lot more. Enjoy. Brad, thank you so much for joining me today. And I've come across a lot of your research before, a lot of your videos and interviews as well. And what I find fascinating is that the science of bodybuilding has gone from this almost fringe science 10 years ago, and now it's really become mainstream with the rise of social media, people on TikTok, Instagram, YouTube, who are both bodybuilders, but also science communicators and translating some of that science, which you were integral in producing, which was mainly in, on PubMed or online in blogs, but now it's coming into social media, and that nitty gritty of the science, how to gain muscle, supplements, it's now reaching a wider public audience. What's your opinion on the rise of this kind of science bro bodybuilding world?
It's somewhat of a double-edged sword. So look, for me, I couldn't be happier that muscle development is getting more attention from a scientific standpoint, but as we all know, the internet can be also a cesspool for miscommunicating science abusing science, abusing it. So, like I said, it can be somewhat of a double-edged sword because there is also a lot of misapplication, in my opinion, my humble opinion, of the science that we're producing, where people have a confirmation bias and they'll cherry pick certain studies to support an opinion or even take studies out of context, the results of studies based upon to support their given preconceived biases, and that can be problematic, obviously.
Now, given there is so much information out there, on a typical feed, I come across dozens and dozens of people giving advice about muscle building, going to the gym, all these sort of things. So for the average member of the public wanting to train and trying to take some of this advice, where do they actually start? Because they are completely overloaded with this information. And like you said, some of them can be conflicting bits of advice from two different people.
Yeah, so I would say, look, from a generalized standpoint for the general public, it's a matter of getting them into the gym, doing something. And there's actually compelling evidence now that with a fairly minimalistic routine, as far as the amount of time you need to spend in the gym, you can see very good results on average, again, for the general public. Now, there are going to be people that don't respond as well, some respond better, and there are going to be, generally, research reports the means, the averages. So you have to understand your own body and make adjustments. But on a general level, a couple of days a week, spending, an hour total per week in the gym can get you quite good results, just doing very basic lifts.
Is that saying that if someone has one session a week, they can make a certain degree of gains? And if they simply increase their frequency, they can keep making more gains? Is there overall diminishing returns up to a certain point? And does it also depend on the intensity and volume in that one session per week if someone only had that time?
Yeah, so this is where the nuances start to come into play. So one session a week, it would be difficult to, you can make some gains, but that certainly would be very substandard. 2 days a week generally would be kind of what I would consider a bare minimum, where the work is spread out over those two sessions, the volume. Now, again, frequency, there's a trade-off between volume. I don't know how deep you want to get into it, but there certainly is going to be diminishing returns after a certain point. Where those diminishing returns are will depend upon genetics, lifestyle factors, goals. So what I would say is that you don't need to do very high volumes or spend a lot of time in the gym to get good results. If you want to be a bodybuilder, there is evidence that somewhat more, if not a decent amount more, would be beneficial. But even that is going to show plateauing to a certain respect. And that also will, again, depend upon individual genetics and lifestyle factors and other things. So it's not a cookie cutter, and there is no cookie cutter answer that I can give to that. Ultimately, I can give generalized guidelines, generalized recommendations, and then people have to take the recommendations as a template and then experiment to see where they go from there.
When I first started in the gym, one of the older heads I was training with was obsessed with the idea of training to failure. And I guess this is a vestige of the old sort of school mentality of bodybuilding where you must incorporate the training to failure. And I guess a plethora of new research has suggested that that's a bit of a myth, that you can still make optimal gains with a suboptimal or sub-maximal level of training. You don't need to train to failure to get those same gains. And whether that's due to better recovery when you're not training to failure, less chance of injury, but also the same degree of muscle fiber recruitment, I don't know. But why is it that not training to failure and really maximizing your effort doesn't lead to more gains necessarily?
Well, when you're asking me to speculate, I mean, mechanistically, it's very difficult to tease out a rationale for why. But I think what needs to be contextualized here is that you still need to train very hard. Just because you don't need to train to failure, you need to train quite hard. So there's something called the repetitions in reserve, where you can perceive how far away you are from failure. And a 1 repetitions in reserve RIR would mean that you think you could get 1 more rep before you would fail. 2 RIR would be 2 more reps before you fail, etc. You need to be pretty close to failure to optimize results, particularly for hypertrophy. Strength, there seems to be less of a need for that. At least the evidence that we have seems to show that. So why speculating on a mechanism would be very, very hypothetical, but I would say that it could be that once there's a threshold, that once you reach a certain threshold, you're recruiting and stimulating the muscle sufficiently where additional stimulation is not beneficial. I could also speculate that failure training on multiple set routines will compromise the subsequent volume load on subsequent sets that you do. So let's say you do a set to failure versus with a 2 RIR, and then you're going to do another set and you try to use the same weight, you're going to actually get fewer repetitions, depending upon how long you rest. If you're resting a long period of time, it won't really matter. But with normal rest periods that people generally take of, let's say, 2 minutes, it will somewhat compromise. Now, not a lot, but you're going to see some decrement versus if you had a 2 RIR. And thus, it could just be a function of volume load. Whether these are true or not is not, we don't have hard evidence. So again, I'm just making guesses educated guesses as to how that might come about.
So I guess most people, when they go to the gym, if they employ a personal trainer or they follow some routines or programs they find online, they may be given a certain number of repetitions of an exercise to do and a certain number of sets, do 3 sets of 10 or 12, and they're given these very strict numbers. Do you think, given that sort of culture where we're almost entrained to think that we need to do 3 or 4 sets of 8 to 10 to 12 of certain things, most people almost don't know how to train to that point of failure or with that given intensity? Because when I first started the gym, if you had told me that I want you to do this bench press up to the point where you've only got 2 more reps left in you, I wouldn't really understand how to get to that point or what that point would feel like.
Yeah, it's a great point. And to be accurate at estimating your repetitions in reserve, you need to have a concept of where failure is. If you've never trained to failure, you're not going to be able to estimate how far you are away from failure. One thing I will say quite conclusively from my research over many, many years now, is that most people are not training anywhere near hard enough to optimize their gains. So when we get people into our studies, and the majority of them, they're training to failure, and we're pushing them to train to failure, they end up at the end of the study saying they've never trained this hard before. So it indicates to me the vast majority of people don't really have a good concept of failure, and that's problematic, just as to the extent that they're probably training far less hard or far further away from failure than they might think, like you stated.
So, I mean, what does that feel like? Just, I mean, training to failure, I guess, in me personally, I don't think I've ever trained to failure on any large compound exercises necessarily like a squat or a deadlift, but I have trained to failure on smaller muscle groups like triceps or biceps. Is that a more safer place to train to failure to know what it feels like rather than those heavy compound lifts?
Well, when you say safer, you're talking about avoiding injury?
Yeah.
Yeah, I certainly would agree with that machine training in general is going to be safer. Now, you could do a squat on a Smith machine and make it safer. If you're doing a free weight squat, yes, is there a greater chance of injury when you're training to failure? I would say that certainly would be the case. Or, I mean, a bench press, I would say somewhat less so, assuming you have a spotter. But I would say even more safe would be a machine bench press, so like a hammer strength or a selectorized machine. So yeah, I think failure training can be more safely carried out on a machine or in more simple type movements, a biceps curl, if you will. And that certainly can be one of the reasons why a lot of people don't train to failure, and certainly in your compound movements, because rightly so, there can be if you don't have a spotter in particular, which many people don't, they go to the gym. It's not like they have someone who's going to be standing there. It would be an unnecessary risk to take. If you're not a power lifter, there's not really much reason that you need to do 1RMs or training with that intensity of effort.
I find that, so the gym I go to right now is a sort of combination of a powerlifting gym / CrossFit gym, but it's also got a couple of these old school bodybuilding machines, like sort of hack squats, pendulum squats and things. It's got a mishmash of different things. It's not like a modern gym with, all of these different, benches and exercise machines. So whenever I travel somewhere or go to a hotel and it's got a gym and I've got a rack of dumbbells and all of these machines, I sometimes find that my efficiency of training is a bit better because I can just sit down on a machine and do 5 or 6 sets of an exercise without needing to stack the weights, put it back on. So there's like that lag time of me not training isn't there. So in a 30, 40-minute workout, I can get a lot more work done just because I have to just sit on a machine and move the pin. But a lot of people historically and traditionally think of machine-based exercises of less than a dumbbell or a barbell exercise because it's a machine and it's seen as, I don't know, like in some way inferior. But can you get the exact same strength and hypertrophic gains from machine-based exercises as you can with free weights?
I don't like to use the term exact same, but so machines and free weights have certain advantages and disadvantages that they're very complementary, and generally using both are synergistic. But so machines are going to have the benefit, number one, to some extent of safety. Usually you're not going to need a spotter depending on the machine. Number two, as you said, they can be more efficient, particularly selectorized machines where you just have to put in a pin or change a pin to increase or decrease weight. There are some machines like hammer strength machines where there are plates that are added to it, and that can be to some extent more time consuming. And also machines generally can allow you to better target a given muscle. So if you're looking to target, let's say, one of the rectus femoris, which is one of the quadriceps muscles, a leg extension could be a better option than a squat or a leg press because of just how it's designed. On the other hand, free weight exercises generally are going to train more muscle mass. So they can be somewhat more globally efficient, that you don't need to work on. So when you're doing, let's say, a squat, you're working many muscles. Now, maybe not optimally, but you have to stabilize through your spinal erectors, your rectus spinae, which are your back muscles along the spine, and many other muscles. So your calves, to some extent, your hamstrings as well. We'll get some activation in your glutes. If you're doing just a leg extension, there's going to be virtually no effect on those muscles. So you'd have to do other exercises. So again, you have to understand the limitations and the benefits to each modality. And like I said, as a general rule, if you want optimal muscle development, combining them can be most beneficial. Now with that said, I think for the general public, basic machine exercises can get you a majority of your gains. It's not going to make, I don't think, a practically meaningful difference to many people, or if not most of the general public. So their need to use free weights is minimized. And I would also say that the concept of quote unquote functional training, that you get better functional enhancements from free weights to machines, at the very least, is overstated. That you can get there's people that will say you don't have functional improvements from machines, and that's just silly. There's compelling evidence that is not the case. And if you're an athlete, could there be benefits to free weights over machines? I would say yes. I think the evidence does point in that direction. But for the general public, I think that whether you would find practically meaningful differences in those is questionable.
I mean, another thing, when I was first starting out in the gym and, was training with other people, I remember as a newbie being told, if you want to tone your muscles, you need to have high reps, low weights. And if you want to build mass and strength, you need to have low reps and heavy weights, which obviously I took for granted back then. But then obviously reading all of the body of research, you can gain muscle and strength at any rep range, essentially. So, I mean, is it possible for someone to just stay at a static weight for many weeks and maybe even many months and do all of these things which old school bodybuilding told us you couldn't do for muscle building, but still continue to gain muscle? So, you're doing very, very high reps of something, but still gain a similar amount of muscle to maybe a heavier weight with lower reps?
Yeah, so this is something that my opinion has changed 180 degrees on the topic. When I was an up-and-coming sports scientist, it was always taught, it's in the NSCA textbook, The Essentials of Strength and Conditioning, which is considered by many to be the seminal textbook on strength and conditioning, talked about this repetition continuum, and it was always taught that if you use light loads, anything more than 12, you start getting into your higher rep ranges, 15 plus repetitions, that you basically would not activate and stimulate the highest threshold motor units, which are attached to these what are called type 2 muscle fibers, which have the greatest propensity for strength and hypertrophy muscular gains, so size gains. And the evidence over time, and our lab has done quite a few studies on this now, compellingly shows, I would say that there's not many topics I speak with high confidence on. This is one where on a whole muscle level, you can get very similar gains regardless of the load up to 30 plus repetitions. So anywhere, if you're doing so 30 repetitions would be a very light load. Now, there is going to be, again, some upper threshold where, I was involved in collaborating on a study where we showed that if you're in really ridiculously high rep ranges, it was 70 reps, you were not able to achieve as good hypertrophy. But anyone that can last 70 reps, I think basically they stopped close to failure from boredom. Now, by the way, this is predicated on training close to failure, on being really pushing, with a high degree of effort. You're not just doing light weights and then saying, I did my reps and I'm putting the weight down. So you're training really hard. And it's anyone who's ever used light loads, trained hard with light loads, will know that it actually, generally most people hate it, and hate it more than doing so with heavier loads. I will give you a quick anecdote that we carried out a study in trained men where we had them do, one group did 10, on average of 10 reps to failure. The other group did on average 30 reps to failure. The group doing on average of 30 reps to failure, half of them puked during the first week of training.
Wow.
They were not happy campers. Now, they adapted to it, so there is an acclimation because there's a lot of what's called acidosis. There's a buildup of hydrogen ions, which are a component of lactic acid, and it causes this burning sensation that can cause a very uncomfortable feeling in the body. Most people doing it said they would not want to do it again. But by the way, so that leaves choice. And I will say there are certain people that, through injury, or conditions like osteoarthritis, are not able to train with somewhat heavier loads. And you don't necessarily push them to failure. You don't necessarily have to go to all out failure. If you're stopping 2, maybe 3 reps short of failure, we don't really have great evidence on this, but I would say you probably would be able to get just as good good gains, whether it's exactly the same, it's hard to say, but I think you could certainly get a majority of those gains training relatively close to failure.
What about going to the other extreme? So we've mentioned that you can get pretty good gains with training close to failure with very high reps up to 30. What about if someone was doing very heavy weights and they could just manage a couple of reps? Is that still beneficial versus doing 5 or 6 reps of a very heavy weight? Does it work at that minimal end of the frequency extreme?
So it depends what you're referring to, whether it's strength or hypertrophy. Now, by the way, I addressed with the light loads, I was speaking specifically to hypertrophy.
Yeah.
But strength gains, you can certainly gain good strength, even resistance trained subjects gain good strength. There is a specificity aspect. And you have better strength gains, at least when you're testing on a exercise that was used in the routine. So if you're like using the squat and doing high reps versus low reps, and then you test for a 1 repetition max on the squat, you will see better gains with the heavier loads, those that did the heavier loads than the lighter loads. If you're testing on an independent strength test, like an isometric test, it's less so. There still seems to be some specificity, but the gap narrows. Now that it continues with heavier when you're talking about very heavy loads, and the closer you're getting to your 1 rep max, it's a basic extrapolation of the principle of specificity. The closer you're getting to your 1 rep max, the better the transfer is to the strength gains. So if you're doing, let's say, 2 or 3 reps and training consistently with it, you're going to get better strength gains than if you train with 10 reps. And then that would get you better strength gains than 20 reps, et cetera. The issue is when it comes to hypertrophy is that it's volume load dependent. So my dissertation research, interestingly, was on this very topic. So we looked at my dissertation looked at a volume equated routine where one group did 3 sets of 10 repetitions, which is kind of like a bodybuilding type routine. The other group did 7 sets of 3 repetitions, so that the overall volume load, so basically volume load is weight times reps times sets, not just the number of sets, but you have to factor in the amount of weight, and we equated ultimately the volume load here. And the hypertrophy was quite similar. However, here's the caveat to that. At the end of the study, the group that was doing 7 sets of 3 were trashed. So high volume with heavy loads really does a number on your joints, and the majority of subjects, at the very least, were complaining that they felt fatigued and just were not happy. And we had 2 injuries. There were people that were complaining of back soreness, lower back soreness. So you got to be cognizant of that. And I just don't think it's an efficacious way to train over time. I don't think that you can, effectively utilize that over long periods of time. I think adding in some heavy load training can be beneficial for particularly increasing maximal strength. Generally speaking, you want to be 5 to 6 reps at minimum, having a 5 to 6 rep minimum threshold, because when you start getting below that and using the volumes that are necessary to maximize gains, it can compromise your health, your injury status.
What is your opinion in terms of, I guess, sustainability during a training session. A lot of people have fixated ideas about rest periods between sets and even between different exercises. Do you have any thoughts about that? Is there an optimal rest period, or does it purely depend on how ready you feel for the next exercise to do it to the best ability and the best form?
Yeah, so anytime, again, when we talk about quote unquote optimal, we look on averages because different people, there's going to be, it depends, answers to a bunch of these questions. So number one, what is the exercise? Is it a leg extension or is it a squat? The difference in rest would make a difference between those two movements. Your age can enter into that. So, older people generally tend to have more impaired recovery. Your training status can have an effect on that. So there's various factors, genetics, lifestyle factors. So when we talk about these things, we talk on average. We actually just did a meta-analysis where we looked at the body of literature on the topic and quantified the values. And what we found was that it seemed that if you're under 90 seconds, you will start to compromise your gains. Not a lot, but that when you're resting, let's say 1 minute between sets, there was somewhat of a compromise in hypertrophy. And once you got to 90 seconds on average, that didn't seem to make much difference. But again, we weren't able to sub-analyze compound multi-joint, free weight exercise versus a machine single joint exercise, or different age groups, and other, again, potential what we call confounding variables. To your original question, though, I think in general, a good rule of thumb, and there's some preliminary evidence to support this, is that you should get back to training, assuming that you have been training for a while and that you have a good idea of your recovery. You go back and do the next set when you feel you're ready. Now, if you're a beginner, you don't really have any comparatives to go by. And thus, I think they're having, let's say, somewhat hard minute prescription is a beneficial thing there. So let's say 90 seconds to 2 minutes, or perhaps a little more if you're doing heavy compound exercises. But if you are a trained lifter, I think that most trained lifters are able to gauge when they're ready. Certainly that's what I do when I'm training. I don't sit there with my watch and say, all right, 2 minutes, I can go now. I say, am I feeling ready? And generally speaking, there's some evidence that is just as effective and maybe more time efficient than by going by your clock.
What about instead of a classical rest period where you just stopped and didn't do anything for the 60 or 90 seconds, you instead did a superset where maybe you worked an antagonistic muscle or completely different muscle group. For example, you're doing a lat pull down exercise for your back, and then in your rest period, you did some leg exercises or you did some tricep exercises, working different muscle groups. Is that superior sometimes, according to the literature, in terms of gaining some performance enhancement, strength enhancement?
So the answer is no, it's not superior from a muscular adaptation standpoint, but on the good side, it doesn't compromise your gains. And it's apropos you mentioned that, one of my students, shout out to Ryan Burke, who recent graduate of our master's program, just completed his thesis on this very topic. We did agonist-antagonist supersets, so biceps, triceps, chest press, lat pull down, leg extension, hamstring curl. So we did those exercises. So those are what are called agonist-antagonists, where you work opposing muscle groups. Very similar hypertrophy on all the muscles that we analyzed. But the superset group was able to finish the workout in 40% less time. So it allowed a much more efficient training protocol than doing the standard 2-minute rest.
And I guess going on and extrapolating from the supersets, another it's sort of variant, but the idea of drop set. So I guess no rest period, but you progressively decrease the weight and maybe even increase the frequency or number of reps you do, and you continually keep dropping the weight and you have no rest. So you end up maybe doing 6 or 7 or more sets of one particular exercise, but then you're just modulating the intensity in a different way. Has that got any benefits for muscular adaptation?
So kind of a similar answer as to supersets. So the literature that we have shows that if you're using drop sets to equate volume, so you're accumulating similar amounts of volume, that the results seem to be similar, and you can use drop sets as a time efficient, so you do it the same volume in less time. What hasn't really been studied well is adding on drop sets, let's say on your last set, to increase the volume. So basically getting greater volume without substantially increasing the time. So instead of waiting 2 minutes and doing another set, if you just add on volume by doing drop sets or double drop sets, could that enhance your results? We don't have good evidence on that, but it's certainly something that could be experimented with.
I remember when I first got into resistance training, whether it was just me being lazy or just not doing the correct technique, I would almost intuitively say for a bicep curl, sometimes start with the weight, down at the bottom and take it up to 90 degrees and go back down. And I was admonished by other people I was lifting with and said, no, you have to do the full range of motion. So going from the bottom all the way to the top. And, stumbling upon some of the research you did suggesting that, these partial length exercises or, not doing the full range of motion is actually equivalent in terms of muscular adaptation and, hypertrophy.
Yeah, what has to be emphasized, though, is that it depends where the partial is occurring. So we're talking about partials in what are called the lengthened position, so the stretched position. On a biceps curl, it's the initial phase. On a squat, it's coming. So if you're doing, let's say, little quarter squats, the evidence, at least for certain muscle groups, particularly the glutes, you are not optimally stimulating them. If you would do, this hasn't been well studied, but it seems that the deep position of the squat would be the most important part of that movement. So yes, it would depend somewhat on where the repetition of partial is occurring, but the literature now does suggest is that the most important portion of a movement is the portion that is in the stretched position. And that whether you would get, at least from a hypertrophy standpoint, strength is a different topic, because there may be that could be specific to the outcome that you're looking to achieve. But from a hypertrophy standpoint, that if you emphasize the stretched position, you will optimize hypertrophy. And if you are emphasizing the shortened position, you would seem to shortchange in most muscle groups, at least in many muscle groups, the hypertrophy.
So if someone was purely concerned with hypertrophy and muscle growth, could they make and build an entire workout just from these lengthened partial range of motions versus doing exercises with a full range of motion?
Conceivably. Now, I think doing deep squats would be somewhat difficult, partials and deep squats, because you're in this lower position, and then if you're close to failure, if you don't know, it can be difficult then to get back up and to go to, because that's where your sticking point is. So if you're in this lengthened position for certain movements or a leg press, you might not be able to push it up. You certainly would need a spotter or something on many of these movements. So you need to be cognizant of what you're doing, but certainly for certain exercises, it would be very feasible.
Now, when I spoke to Mike Israetel, we were sort of discussing the benefits of creatine. And, it's one of those things which is obviously very widely studied, and it has a, pretty decent side effect profile in terms of, not being a major risk factor for, anything in terms of giving you any major side effects for, a normal, healthy population. I came across something that you said recently, and you spoke about hyper responders to creatine. And you mentioned that vegans were more likely to respond positively to creatine than carnivores, for example. And is that mainly because of a relative lack of creatine in their diet?
Yeah, so creatine is contained in meat-based products. So either beef, chicken, fish, are replete in creatine. So generally, those who are vegan are going to not have their creatine stores filled, quote unquote, as much as those who eat meat. And you need to think of creatine So it's stored within the muscles and some other tissues as well. But obviously for muscular adaptations, it would be the muscle stores that are of relevance. And you think of it like a glass. And if you're going to fill up your glass with water, once that glass is filled, you can keep pouring the water, but you're not going to get any benefits. You're not going to be able to drink more water from once your glass is filled. And ultimately, once your creatine stores are filled, taking more creatine through supplemental means is not going to further saturate your creatine stores. And that's why those who have, let's say their glass is half full, if you will, of creatine, you'd be able to enhance that effect and see greater gains.
Just going back to training for a moment, people often talk about muscle memory. And, I guess some people think that this is almost like a myth built up by the bodybuilding community. And obviously there's lots of science suggesting that it's an actual physiological response that the body does when maybe you are well trained and you have an injury, or you have a several week absence from training, and maybe you lose some muscle mass because of the absence of training, but then your muscle memory potentially kicks in and you can regain the muscle tissue lost in a rapid period of time, and you can make similar gains in also a shortened period of time. Is there significant truth behind that? And what is the science behind muscle memory?
So there are two types of quote unquote muscle memory. You have neuromuscular, which is coordination patterns. That's kind of like the riding a bike. And that's undoubtedly, unequivocally true that, so if you've been lifting before and you go back in the gym, there's going to be neuromuscular memory to remembering those movement patterns, how to carry out the movement, to be able to focus on the muscle more. And that in itself would be beneficial. There is also, a different type of muscle memory, which is generally related, and there's some nuances to this, and I think it's beyond the scope of getting into the weeds with this, but the primary way is through what are called myonuclei. So muscles have nuclei, and muscle and bone are the only multinucleated tissues in the body. And your nucleus is what allows the transcription of proteins. Not to give a physiology lesson, but proteins need to be transcribed from the nucleus and then sent to your what are called ribosomes to be translated into muscle proteins. And I'm sure I just put half the audience to sleep in saying that. But just with that as background, more nuclei are going to allow more transcription, which is going to allow for greater translation of these proteins, more muscle proteins to be created, synthesized. And it's somewhat of a controversial topic, but in my opinion, I think the evidence is at least pointing towards some retention of the nuclei. So I should take a step back and say that as you train, your body adds nuclei. So you have a certain number of nuclei as a sedentary individual. And when you start training and you start building your muscles, when the muscles get beyond a certain point, the body needs more nuclei to continue growing, and it will manufacture these nuclei via something called satellite cells, which are basically muscle stem cells. And they donate their nuclei to the muscle, and they allow for greater transcription so you can continue growing over time. It's important to understand that there is some evidence that the body actually retains these nuclei after you stop training, so that once you start retraining, you don't have to create the nuclei again. The body can just kind of take off and make more rapid gains. Now, there's other evidence, by the way, that does question that. And I think it's a topic that still is somewhat underexplored, and that we don't have, I can't speak with great confidence on it, but in the evidence that I've seen, I would say the evidence is skewing towards my thought that there is a muscle memory through this retention of nuclei.
And I guess another, similar myth that's been built up is this idea about the pump. And I know you spoke about this, mythical pump, and I guess there's no significant body of science which suggests that it may be anabolic in any way, but I guess you gave some sort of mechanistic idea that it sort of increased or the swelling of the sort of individual cells triggers some cascade of anabolic responses due to the stretch receptors triggered. Is there some good science behind that sort of pump, that vascularity, and the feeling of sort of intense swelling you feel in your muscles during a workout that actually contributes to the anabolic response?
So there's good science in test tubes that if you hydrate a cell, it will increase protein synthesis and decrease protein breakdown. That is we call in America a hypertrophy home run. So if you're increasing synthesis and decreasing breakdown, your protein balance will be highly skewed in terms of being positive, and that promotes muscle growth. But what happens in a cell does not necessarily translate to what happens in practice. So there's no studies that we don't have evidence one way or the other. People that dismiss the possibility, in my opinion, are misguided because absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. Now, we can use the test tube data as hypothesis generating information, data to suggest that there may be, create a logical rationale why it may happen. And thus, my general rule of thumb, you look at everything, certainly in training from an applied standpoint, as a cost benefit. What is the negative effects of doing something versus what are the positive effects, potential positive effects? There's no negative effect of getting a pump, at least none that's been demonstrated, and there is a potential positive benefit. Whether it actually does enhance the hypertrophic response, I think it's 50-50. You know, I think it could or it might not. We don't have good evidence either way in vivo, what is called in vivo in the living. So we don't have. It's very difficult to study topics like this because when you create the pump, you're altering other potential mechanistic factors that can potentially be explanatory. You'd have to find a way to increase the pump without altering other potential confounding variables, and that is quite difficult, particularly without doing something invasive, which can be problematic in carrying out a study.
Yeah, I guess, when someone has the pump, there's confounding factors like increased blood flow, maybe psychological factors as well. But I guess beyond that, if someone was a newbie starting out in the gym or even, an intermediate level trainer looking to further optimize their gains, with all this information surrounding them, what would be some very basic tenets of advice or information you'd give for both a newbie or even an intermediate to continue or begin their strength training journey?
Yeah, so for newbies, I think the most important thing is not worrying about your gains. Don't worry about hypertrophy or strength. Worry about getting coordination in your movement patterns. The first several months of training should just be focused on technique, on mastering the lifts. Now, that's going to be much easier in machines than it would in free weights, but you need to get if you're just going to use machines, then you can do that in a quicker period of time. But even machines takes getting used to. You should learn to master those movements. You should do it somewhat slowly. Certainly, you should not be very sore. You shouldn't overdo it. A lot of times people want to make all their gain. They're, all right, I'm committing to a program, so I need to really get in the gym and really train hard. And you end up becoming so sore, as I did, by the way. It was a huge mistake I made. It almost scared me off of going back to the gym where I was walking around like I was Frankenstein for a week. So you want to acclimate, ease into it over time. And then, as we talked about earlier, also start working towards training to failure so you can understand how close you are to failure. I think that all can be done within the first couple months, 2-3 months. Once you've had that training under your belt, then you start to worry about the other factors. And that's when you want to be somewhat more scientific about it. But then again, I would say it depends on your goals. For those who, with very modest goals, if you just want to gain some muscle, get healthier, gain some strength, and you're time pressed, as many people are, time is the number one barrier why people say they don't resistance train. Do a couple days of training per week, 2 1/2 hour sessions, 1 to 2 sets per exercise, or just pick exercises that work the total musculature, focus on your compound movements as well, so you can work in some of the supporting muscles, what are called the synergistic muscles. And then I would say, just to get a little more fancy, if your goals become a little more high level where you want to gain more muscle, then you're going to have to add in generally some volume, higher volumes to the equation, maybe using some advanced training methods, perhaps heavy negatives, lengthened partials added on. That's again a topic that would take an 8-hour seminar, which I do, by the way, just to get into all the nuances of optimizing muscle. And so again, to get 75% of your gains can be done with relatively simple training. To get those last 20-25% of your gains, that's where you really need to start using more scientific thinking.
Yeah, I think as we're beginning to understand more and more and appreciating that, the muscle is akin to an organ, a metabolically active organ, which has a role to play in our health span and longevity as well. It's great for you to provide all of this information and really bring the science to the forefront when it comes to evidence-based lifting, physiology, and improving lifestyle. So, Brad, I just really want to thank you for coming on and providing those science-based tips.
My pleasure.
Thanks again to Dr. Brad Schoenfeld. Were you surprised to learn that you can get fit just training twice a week? How are you going to switch up your routine and training after listening to Brad? Let me know in the comments. Make sure you subscribe so you don't miss the weekly Dr. Karan Explores podcast, and I'll see you cute organic sacks of muscles next week.